Thanks, Peter, for an interesting presentation. And now we'll go to our third speaker, Chuck Peña, who's a senior fellow here at the Institute.
Good afternoon. Ivan hasn't given me a time limit, but since I know I stand between you and two important things, and first questions, second lunch, I will do my best to keep my remarks relatively brief. Peter, to address the first part of your remarks, I am Californian by birthright, Northern California specifically, since you talked about how people identify. I also want to congratulate Ivan for being pretty prescient about scheduling this particular event. He and I actually talked about this maybe 6 weeks or so ago, and who would know that it would happen the week after President Obama decided to make his speech about ramping up troops in Afghanistan. The title of today's event is, Can We Withdraw from Iraq and Afghanistan? I'm going to focus my remarks mostly about Afghanistan, but I would say 80 to 90% of what I have to say you could probably just transfer over and wholesale to Iraq. So I thought it was interesting that Ivan chose that the term, can we withdraw? The simple answer is yes, absolutely, no problem. All the president has to do is make a decision. I mean, whenever talk about military withdrawal comes up, everybody throws up all the reasons you can't do it, how complicated it is, and all the politics involved. The bottom line is the commander-in-chief can make the decision. All he or she has to do is make it. And then he tells the Secretary of Defense, who then works with the chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff and the COCOMs, make it happen. It's that simple. So the answer to can we withdraw is yes, always has been yes. You just have to have the political will to make the decision to withdraw. So then the next question that comes up then is, well, okay, if how do you do that, right? I mean, it's a logistical nightmare, and yeah, it is, particularly in Iraq at the moment. It is a bit of a logistical nightmare. But in Afghanistan, yeah, you can withdraw, and let me suggest, the president has said that he would like to begin withdrawal of troops in Afghanistan in roughly 18 months. At 2 brigades a month, which is not unreasonable, which is about that's an average rotation that's not unreasonable at all. At 2 brigades a month, we can be out in less than 18 months out of Afghanistan. In fact, we can probably be out in close to a year if you made that decision now to draw down at roughly 2 brigades. 2 brigades, by the way, is about 7,000 troops, depending on whether it's combat or combat support. So the how is also fairly doable, and you tell the folks on the Joint Staff, figure out the logistics, you work with the COCOM to figure it all out, and you find a way to bring the troops out. Of course, the part of the problem, particularly in Iraq, is the equipment. How do you get the equipment out? Because we've got a lot of heavy equipment in there now. We have less so in Afghanistan, so it's probably a little bit easier. But again, not logistically easy, but logistically doable. And I would suggest that if you made the decision today that you wanted to withdraw rather than ramp up in Afghanistan, you could be out in less than 18 months, which is when the president says he would actually like to begin withdrawing forces from Afghanistan. So if you can do it, because it's just simply a decision, and how you do it is doable, what it really comes down to is, should you? I mean, really, and so maybe the more appropriate question is, should we withdraw from Iraq and Afghanistan? Rather than belabor the point on Iraq, let me focus on Afghanistan, although, as I said, I think at least strategically the logic applies pretty equally to both. The answer to should we withdraw is yes, okay? And let me walk through an argument as to why that answer is yes. First of all, the proposed ramp-up of troops, 30,000, which is less than what General McChrystal wanted. He wanted 40,000. The President and his advisors decided 30,000 instead of 40,000, and General McChrystal, being the good general, has saluted, said, yes, sir, I can still win with 30,000, even though I asked for 40,000 troops. It's not enough. Ivan alluded to this, the rule of, it's both the rule of thumb It's what General Petraeus, General McChrystal's superior officer, wrote in the counterinsurgency manual that the United States military now uses, and it's what history has demonstrated. You need about 20 soldiers per every 1,000 civilians to be able to effectively run a counterinsurgency operation. In Afghanistan, with a population of more than 30 million people, you're looking at a force, a footprint of more than 600,000 troops required to run an effective counterinsurgency. We don't have 600,000 ground forces in the United States Army. You could combine the active duty Army and Marines and get to 600,000, but there's no way that we can get to that number if we had to. And so the roughly 100,000 U.S. troops after the surge, give or take, plus the NATO troops, enough to do what in terms of counterinsurgency? Enough to occupy Kabul and keep Hamid Karzai ensconced as the mayor. Enough maybe to occupy 2 or 3 more provinces in Afghanistan, but not enough to occupy the country, not enough to run an effective counterinsurgency. So what happens when you have a small force trying to run counterinsurgency? You play whack-a-mole. You subdue the enemy in one area, and then when you say, hey, we've got pacification, you move on to the next area, and as you move on to the next area, what generally happens is the place you pacified before, violence erupts there. Why? Because there's nobody there minding the store. Of course, the solution that the President has proposed, which is, by the way, the same solution that President Bush proposed in Iraq, is we will train the Afghans to take control of their own security. During the Bush administration is, you know, as they stand up, we'll stand down. That is exactly what President Obama is proposing in Afghanistan. So, A, you don't have enough troops to run effective counterinsurgency. You may or may not have enough to run an effective counterterrorism strategy in Afghanistan. So that's problem number one, and a reason why we should withdraw rather than stay. Number two, no political leader in the United States has ever admitted to the American public what's required to run an effective counterinsurgency. Okay? We make it sound as though if we just put in enough troops, and Obama also talked about bringing in more civilians, there's also going to be a civilian surge, State Department and other services, that, you know, we'll just do this in a kinder, gentler way. You know, we will provide all these services and schools and all, you know, running water and all the amenities that people like. They'll love us and won't turn against us as a result. And so between the military and the civilians, you know, we'll win. Well, that's not really how it's done, or at least that's not what history tells us. History tells us that when you run effective counterinsurgency, you kill lots of people, okay? And if you don't kill them, you incarcerate them, and that you engage in broad brush, relatively harsh tactics to do that. Because what's the point of counterinsurgency is to impose security and order, and you do that any way you can. And it doesn't matter how much collateral damage is involved. It doesn't matter whether you're killing or locking up the right people. What matters is that you're imposing order and security. That is the whole point of running a counterinsurgency operation. You don't do that by killing people with kindness. You do that by using military force, and that's exactly what history has demonstrated. If you look at the British, who are often acknowledged as the experts in counterinsurgency, mostly because they used to have lots of colonies and had to run counterinsurgency operations to have security in their colonial empire. That's what the Brits did. It's not very pretty. It's ugly, and it runs counter to how we believe what we believe we are as a country, which is why presidents, not just this president, any president, doesn't admit to the American public what's required to run an effective counterinsurgency, and so they dress it up in a lot of different ways that are politically more palatable. So, you know, are we do we have enough troops, and are we willing to engage in the kinds of tactics that are necessary to win? And I think the answer there is no, we're not. Number three, how long do we have to stay? Okay, we've already been in there eight years, okay, not sort of as has been suggested, oscillating, going back and forth between, you know, counterinsurgency, counterterrorism, relatively small footprint. Let's ramp up. Now let's ramp up even more. Again, the history of counterinsurgency is 5 to 7 years. Okay, 5 to 7 years with enough troops engaged in the kind of operations that you really need to engage in. That is not exactly not what President Obama has proposed. He's not, in fact, he's even said, much to his credit, he does not want this to be an open-ended nation-building mission. Okay? And I applaud him for that. But if you're going to run effective counterinsurgency, you better plan to be there for a minimum of 5 years. And oh, by the way, the Brits were in Malaysia for 20 years running their counterinsurgency operations there. You better be willing to be there for a long time. This is already an unpopular war with the American public. What are the odds that the American public is going to be willing to put up with 5, 7, 10, 20 more years of this? So from a tactical perspective, I don't think we can win. So those are, I think, 3 strong tactical reasons to withdraw. But most importantly, the one that trumps those 3 is that strategically it's not in our interest to stay. Both Peter and Ivan have talked a little bit about this, but occupation is what fuels resentment, which is what creates terrorists. It creates terrorists in the territory that you're occupying, and as we saw with 9/11, it creates terrorists who may decide that they want to strike you at home, away from the territory that you're occupying. And so, since the whole point of having gone into Afghanistan in the first place, which I would argue we had to do at the time, but since the whole point is to try and reduce the terrorist threat to the United States, not increase the terrorist threat to the United States, at this point in time, 8 years later, having not really achieved the objectives that we wanted to achieve when we first went into Afghanistan, it is now high time for the U.S. to leave and let Afghanistan be run by the Afghans, however imperfect that might be. Okay? Our only criteria has to be that the government, whichever government it is, whether it's the Karzai government, whether it's a Taliban government, that any government in Afghanistan not openly provide aid and shelter to al-Qaeda. And that if they decide to do that, we come back and we do this all over again, which, by the way, is cheaper for those of us who may be worried about the costs. It's cheaper for us to leave, and if things get out of hand again, just come back and do it all over again, than it is for us to stay, to try and make something work that maybe we can't make work. So here are the issues. Number one, both Peter and Ivan have talked about this. The Taliban is not monolithic. We here in the United States tend to equate the Taliban with al-Qaeda. They're not one and the same. There are elements of the Taliban that would support al-Qaeda in wanting to attack the United States. There are other elements of the Taliban. Look, they're just interested in having a say in the government in Afghanistan. We've got to stop treating them monolithically as a single threat, as if somehow they are a threat to the United States of America proper. They're not. So we have to be willing to live with less than perfect in terms of what happens in Afghanistan. And I also think that we also have to be willing to concede at this point that what's left of al-Qaeda, whether they're operating out of Pakistan or coming across the border periodically into Afghanistan, and by the way, I saw a news report that supposedly even bin Laden, assuming he's still alive, finds his way across the border into Afghanistan periodically. Al-Qaeda isn't the same Al-Qaeda that existed, that attacked us on 9/11. And bin Laden, in particular, does not have operational control over a group that has global reach that can attack the United States. Our larger problem is not Osama bin Laden and what's left of Al-Qaeda hiding out in Pakistan. Our larger problem is the ideology of radical Islam, which has seeped into the Muslim world, in part because we've helped propagate that by our actions in places like Iraq and Afghanistan. So I would argue whatever benefit there might be to getting bin Laden at this point, and believe me, I would love to be able to say that we got Osama bin Laden, but strategically, the costs required to try and get bin Laden and contain al-Qaeda, the costs far outweigh any residual benefit at this stage and point, given that bin Laden, as bin Laden, and the people surrounding him no longer represent operationally the real threat to the United States. The real threat is sort of everywhere in the Muslim world, being fueled by ideology and anti-American sentiment. And so this notion of denying al-Qaeda safe havens in Afghanistan, I think, is a pie-in-the-sky notion. Al-Qaeda, there will be some safe havens. Why? Because there will always be people who have sympathies and decide they want to support groups like al-Qaeda. The question is, are they local threats or global threats? As long as they're local threats, then those are threats that the Afghan government has to deal with and ones that we may have to live with. Again, less than perfect. It's the global threat that al-Qaeda may represent that we have to worry about. I think we have to worry about that less now than we did 8 years ago. I think we have to worry more about that, you know, we are radicalizing Muslims around the world, as witnessed by the bombings in Madrid and London in particular, and that our very presence in two Muslim countries at the moment, Iraq and Afghanistan, goes a long, long way to fueling that radicalism, that it's U.S. occupation that makes us a target, that there may be a certain amount of anti-Western, anti-U.S. elements in radical Islamic ideology, but most of that is because we're there, we're in their territories, not necessarily that they want to come after the United States in the U.S., and that it doesn't solve all of our problems. I don't want to suggest it's a panacea. And certainly withdrawing from Iraq or Afghanistan doesn't necessarily mean that either country will be a better place from the perspective of Iraqis or Afghans. Peter has alluded that maybe he thinks Iraq would be, and I think that would be great. But our concern is not whether Iraq and Afghanistan are better places. Our concern is whether either one of them represents a threat to the United States. The best way, in my opinion, to move in the right direction to ensure that neither country is a threat to the United States is for the U.S. to withdraw, to give Muslims in those countries less reason to want to target the United States, less reason to have sympathy with the ideology of radical Islam. And you know, we would be a much safer country as a result of doing that. So again, let me reiterate. You know, can we withdraw from Iraq and Afghanistan? Yes. How do we do it? Yeah, we can do it. It's a little bit logistically complicated, but it's certainly doable. But more importantly, should we withdraw? Absolutely, because that's what's in our strategic interests, and those are the kinds of decisions that any president should be making, the decisions that are in our strategic interest. Thank you.